Now that's impressive. From Skybridge to freight vehicles, this conference is covering it all. Our next panel will explore how cities are now leading the way in cross-border trade and climate action.
Thanks very much, Heidi. My name's David Miller. I'm the Director of International Diplomacy at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, which is an organization of nearly 100 of the world's major cities working together to help the world avoid dangerous climate change. Phoenix is a proud member of our organization. And just to give you some sense, the regional population of those cities is about 775 million people, about a quarter of the world's GDP in the regions of our members. So a very important group of mayors working together in partnership to address climate change through a variety of initiatives. We have a terrific panel for you today, which is going to speak from a policy perspective of why cities are involved in climate change and how they look at vehicles and freight, through a more general policy discussion about these issues, down to some very specific discussion of fleets and freight and vehicles and technologies. And we hope to leave some time for questions. So I look very much forward to the panel, look forward to questions of participants. And I'd like to just introduce the panelists before we start. The first panelist is Lolita Jackson, who is the former climate diplomat for New York City. In that capacity, Lolita had an important role in New York City's leadership through Mayor Bill de Blasio's Green New Deal and in the administration of Michael Bloomberg as well. She has worked on responsibilities as diverse as helping lead New York City's representation in international conferences like the Conference of the Parties pursuant to the Paris Agreement. In addition, was part of the New York City team that's led the way on significant climate issues like divestment, energy retrofits of buildings, and much, much more. Prior to joining New York City, she was in the private sector and investment management and has very recently returned to that field. She is now the Executive Director of Communications and Sustainable Cities at Sustainable Development Capital LLP, which is a billion-dollar climate finance and investment firm based in London, England, focusing on energy efficiency, on-site generation, et cetera. Lolita, welcome to the panel, and I'll ask you for your remarks in just a moment. I'm just going to introduce our fellow panelists. Second is Colin Tetreault, who may be well-known, I'm sure, in Phoenix. He's an accomplished sustainability, business policy, and senior scholar and practitioner. He facilitates the Carbon Disclosure Project's engagements with states and regions across the USA and Canada, and is charged with developing innovative solutions to empower states and provinces and public authorities to disclose sustainability performance data that reduces exposure and risk, links innovation and capital development opportunities, and accelerates awareness and action. He's the chair of the City of Phoenix Environmental Quality and Sustainability Commission and the ranking appointed citizen official in the state focused on sustainability. He previously served as the senior policy advisor of sustainability to previous Mayor Stanton of Phoenix and actively leads international and domestic civic organizations. Colin, welcome. We look forward to hearing from you in a few minutes. And our third panelist comes from a very important country to our north, where I hail from as well. Mike, very much welcome. Mike Colborne is the chairman and CEO of the Pacific Western Group of Countries, a very significant organization in Western Canada. That operates 4 business lines consisting of motor coach services, student transportation, employee and transit services. PWT operates in 5 Canadian provinces and the Yukon Territory with over 4,400 buses in the fleet and with approximately 5,200 engaged employees. This privately owned and operated company is recognized in the industry as a quality service provider, operating brands such as the Red Arrow Motor Coach, Diversified Southland, and 23 different municipal transit systems. Mike is an active member of many organizations and boards, and of course divides his time between the business and being an active participant in the lives of his families in his personal time, and I'm surprised he has any being that busy. He sits on many committees and boards such as Rotary, SCAL International, and has volunteered extensively in the past with the Vocational Rehab Research Institute. He also sits on the board of the Strategic Transportation Advisory Committee, which is chaired by the Alberta Minister of Transportation, and is a past board member of the Alberta Economic Development Association, and is on the American Bus Association as the only Canadian board member. And he was born in Alberta and educated at the University of Alberta, where my wife Jill was also educated. So welcome everyone to the panel. I thought today it might be best if we sort of start from the policy perspective of why are cities involved in climate change? What are they trying to do? To give us an insight on the impact on business. And at first, to do that, I'd like to ask Lolita Jackson if she could speak to her perspective about New York City, what it's trying to do, and how it might impact particularly fleets.
Thank you, David, and I'm happy to be here today. I have a heart for Phoenix. I've been there quite a few times. I'm actually going in the beginning of June, so I look forward to coming to see your great city again. Just to give some context, as David indicated in my when he was reading my bio, I worked for the mayor's office for 15 years. So I actually had been around for every climate plan that had ever been written. So many people don't realize that we started really talking about climate very actively in 2007 with something we call Plan YC. And every 4 years, we are mandated as a city to update those plans and come up with new, stronger initiatives to help mitigate climate change. Hurricane Sandy interrupted that process and made it much more urgent. We had $19 billion of lost economic activity. You may remember that all of Manhattan below 30th Street was dark because of a substation, electrical substation caught fire the night of Hurricane Sandy. So Wall Street was closed. The New York Stock Exchange was closed. All those businesses were closed. People had to leave their homes for months, or not months, but for weeks because there was no power. So the economic impact of climate is very, very real. And also we lost 44 New Yorkers. 44 people live in New York City's borders did pass away due to Hurricane Sandy. So it was not just mitigation anymore, it was actually adapting to our 520 miles of coastline and sea level rise. We've already had 6 inches of sea level rise in New York City since the year 1900, and we are predicting if we don't do anything about climate change, we're going to have maybe 6 inches or more to come. So it's very important to deal with these things. Also, half of our food comes into one place called Hunts Point Market in the Bronx. If Hurricane Sandy had happened at a different time of day, that would have been flooded because it's in the floodplain. So it's not just the moral and right thing to do, it also affects us economically as a city. 50% of children in one particular neighborhood called, East Harlem have asthma due to decades of pollutants in their neighborhood from fleets, from trucks, from a highway nearby. So this is really an urgent matter for New York City to deal with. Some of the things that we have done to try to mitigate the effects of climate change in New York City are, as David indicated earlier, we're divesting from fossil fuels. So all fossil fuel reserve owners will be divested from completely in New York City. And we have a $200+ billion pension fund, so it's not a small amount of money. Also going to go up to $50 billion in investments in clean energy solutions. And that will increase up to the year 2040. And that's an initiative that we're doing around the world. New York City is doing around the world, being led somewhat by C40. So thank you for the leadership with that, David. The next thing is that we're doing is that 70% of all emissions in New York City actually come from buildings. A lot of us don't drive. I haven't owned a car since 1990. I know it's unheard of on this call, but I've not owned a car in 30 years. And most New Yorkers are in my situation. We take the subway, we walk, particularly if you live in Manhattan. So really getting to building emissions and getting those emissions down will really get our emissions down as a city. So we have a law we passed a few years ago called Local Law 97, which is the Climate Mobilization Act, where every building over 25,000 square feet has to retrofit by 2024 or they get fines. We have been benchmarking the performance of all of our buildings for some time, so we know what numbers they all need to reach. And this law obviously was heavily contested by certain elements, but we really need to get the emissions down in New York City. And also New York City is doing their own work. We have 1 million school children in New York City. So imagine all those school buildings, all the firehouses, all the police stations, et cetera. So even just our own city buildings. And 80% of the buildings that are standing in New York City now will still be standing in 50 years. And so it's really important not just to do new buildings, but also to do the buildings that exist. And finally, I'm going to turn to mobility, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing with our fleets. So with mobility, we recognize that even though we have many people who do not have cars, there's still many cars that come into New York City. As you can imagine, the metropolitan region is almost 20 million people, even only 8.6 of them live actually in New York City. So many of them drive over our bridges and our tunnels to get here. So how do you decrease the amount of cars that are coming in and contributing in that way? The first thing is that the people who live close enough to actually commute in other ways, we have protected bike lanes now. When I first started my role in the mayor's office, there were almost no bike lanes in New York City. Now we have hundreds, if not thousands of miles of bike lanes, and many of them are protected by bollards, so you won't get hit by a truck. And I'll give an example. I think at one point only over 70% of the riders of bicycles were under a certain age and were male, because women were afraid to ride, older people were afraid to ride. So those things are being mitigated and dealt with right now. Also, last mile delivery. So instead of having trucks coming into the city center, the last mile or two, you can use cargo bikes and other methods of getting the goods to people. And in the middle of the pandemic, which is now, you can imagine a lot more people are getting things delivered. And I've seen that those technologies actually being implemented in my neighborhood. I very rarely see trucks anymore. They'll put the trucks somewhere in an arterial road, and then they'll ride it on in a large cargo bike. So we're seeing solutions like that. And finally, on that point, open streets, where we've allowed people, restaurants, to be able to open up and take parking spaces and actually have dining outside. So that lessens the demand on the parking because there's less spaces. Now I'll turn to our fleets. We have something actually called the New York City Clean Fleet Plan. We have the largest municipal fleet in the United States with 30,000 city-owned vehicles of all types. So imagine garbage trucks, the pursuit vehicles, fire trucks, our water, the Department of Environmental Protection, all of those entities have cars. So we have thousands of cars that have already been made electric. We've been investing in hybrids for 15 years. We have over 1,000 charging ports across 696 charging stations with 87 solar carports that are actually off the grid completely. So over 19,000 fleet units are already using some sort of alternative fuel source. And in fiscal 2020, all new police vehicles will be hybrid or electric. Our fleet trucks use biofuels, and that's been in place for some time. So, and we're also procuring hybrid and plug-in ambulances. And finally, we also utilize car share with Zipcar. So rather than people having to have their own assigned vehicle from the city, and I actually experienced this the last role that I had where I had to drive regularly, I had to go get a Zipcar rather than being assigned a car directly to me. So we are employing as many things as possible to get ourselves to have a green fleet and green trucks in New York City. The head of that initiative is a man called Keith Kernan, who's everybody's hero. He's really, really wonderful. He's a cheerleader for this, and he's up front with all city agencies, making sure they're procuring these vehicles and doing the right thing. He's a dedicated public servant, and he's leading our initiatives there. And I hope that that helps with the information and gives you the context for New York City. I'll turn it back to David.
Thanks very much, Lolita, for really setting the vision of why a huge city like New York cares about climate change and the initiatives that it can lead in buildings, in transportation, and particularly in greening its fleet. Even for the private sector, that's a pretty big fleet to take such advanced measures. So I thought we'd now turn to Colin. And Colin, can you, taking from what you've heard from New York City and Lolita, can you speak about the policy framework that you see through your lens at CDP and your various other responsibilities and your past work with Mayor Stanton? What's the policy lens, and any thoughts you have about what policy lens could be in order to help us address the freight fleet part of the challenge of dramatically minimizing emissions, which we must do if we're going to avoid the worst of climate change?
Well, happy to do that. David, thank you so much, and everyone for having me here. Lolita, congratulations on such an incredible tenure and history of work in New York. Certainly, many of us in the municipal space look to you and the multiple administrations that you've served and still currently serve really for inspiration. And I'm well familiar with Plan NYC, having been involved here with our 2009 Climate Action Plan, and under my personal cover, the pleasure of chairing our city's commission now with their most upcoming CAP. I would offer that David, Phoenix and Mayor Gallego are a proud member of the C40 organization, so we're thankful to be amongst other luminary peers here, joining us here and on a global basis as well. You asked the question of broad spectrum policy. So I would offer, Lita, I think really encapsulated many of these things on a local basis, right? Transportation and movement is one of these things that, metaphorically and literally connects us across cultures, locations, and circumstances. So it's imperative, I think, that we actually understand and value the myriad benefits and actually the necessities of investing in that shift from traditional internal combustion engine vehicles to things that are clean, affordable, and equitable for all people across our planet. When I think about this from a policy landscape, I tend to think of this like, maybe envisioning like Dolly Parton in like the patchwork coat, right? That was kind of a nice thing in her song, but I would offer on a federal to a state to a local perspective, there is a patchwork set of policies here that really, I think, create a few things: inefficiencies, it creates confusion in the marketplace, and it inserts unnecessary risk into project and planning. I think Mike will be able to talk about that a little bit more. So kind of my top level here is I think we need to have consistent and cogent policy frameworks from a federal all the way down to a local level. So in this instance, I think that the role of government really needs to be in mindset and application. It should be entrepreneurial. It should empower and embolden these organizations and residents in order to actually cut through the bureaucracy and red tape and achieve these outcomes from a zero emissions perspective. So there's kind of three broad spectrum things. I think we can probably dive into it a little bit more. But my top level things are, I think we need tone from the top, number one. Now, I think even as of yesterday, the administration in Washington and the Department of Energy made a really interesting announcement of over $160 million that they're going to be allocating here appropriations over the next 3 to 4 years with regard to transitioning a multitude of fleets, but especially medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. So I think tone from the top and consistency from the federal government of investments and incentives. I think the second part of that kind of layers down. It's the state and the regional perspective. We need to set catalytic and visionary goals and follow those up on a state basis. And then I think the third one, honestly, I think in order to bridge the divide with economics to the people, is we need to treat transportation like the health and equity crisis that it represents as well. Right? Lolita is coming from a place where you've got about 1.7 million people over 33 square miles. That's kind of the borough of Manhattan. To Phoenix, we have the equivalent population over 520 square miles, where things like air quality and transportation access, right? There's a huge inequity and gap that's perpetrated upon individuals that are lower income and minority of population. So when we bridge the divide, not just from the economics and the movement of goods and services to understanding that transitioning our fleets, transitioning our emissions-based vehicles to a zero emissions base has real and lasting health impacts for communities as well. So those are kind of my top three broadly, but I'll pass it back to you. And I really look forward to hearing what Mike and the rest of the panel has to say. David, you may be doing a wonderful miming impersonation, but I don't know if we have you on the audio.
You're muted, yes.
I was testing people. So thanks very much, Colin, for those remarks. And I think we all look forward to hearing some details about the federal government program in the United States, because it could, first of all, spur action elsewhere, but secondly, as they listen to people and structure it, it could really help be transformative. And I guess I'd like to turn to you, Mike, and just to speak from your perspective as a privately held business, what is realistic from your perspective now in greening the fleet? What do you see as the opportunities? Where does government need to lead? Where does it need to follow? Where does it need to get out of the way?
Thank you so much, David. Well, I'm pretty proud of our company's space in our alternative fuels. We've made a tremendous amount of progress in Canada through our fleets. Back at the Winter Olympics in Whistler, we were fortunate enough to operate the world's largest fleet of hydrogen-powered vehicles. We had a partner of the federal government and the provincial government of BC assisted with the fueling station. For example, was a $3.1 million build just to fuel the buses. So we really need the government to assist and partner with the private sector. And, it really is important that the private sector, who operates large fleets like ourselves, have a chance to, work with the public sector on the infrastructure that they build. One of the things that I'm proud that we do also is we operate the second largest fleet of propane-powered school buses in North America. Now, what makes propane? It's very much like natural gas. It doesn't need the pressure. So the fueling infrastructure is actually very economical, very easy to put in. So that's why the private sector in the school bus industry has really moved to propane. But if by chance that I wanted to put in 50 electric school buses into one of my garages and facilities, I would need an electrical infrastructure to be upgraded in the area for me to accommodate that. The economics don't work for the private sector. So one of the major obstacles I see is that there is the public sector, the governments don't see the value as much as I think they should in working with the private sector, and so that we're all working together in fighting this climate change. So this is a major obstacle I see going forward. Often the public sector will just go ahead and build the infrastructure without the forethought of having private sector company access it, or even the public. So, this is an area that I'd sure like to see improved. David, thank you.
That's great, Colin. Thank you very much for those thoughts. And I think it does kick off a very important second round of questions. I'm going to start with Colin. Mike has spoken to actual projects that his company has done, whether with hydrogen or propane, and potentially with electric. But calls for a partnership with government. And Colin, can you speak from your perspective as a policy leader of some steps that could be taken to expedite this transition from diesel through cleaner fuels to zero emissions tailpipe? And if you could think about freight examples as well as passenger, would be of interest to our participants, I think.
Happy to do it. And I'll agree with Mike, right? So I think kind of one of the refrains I heard him say, and I would absolutely empathize with, not only as a policy leader, but as a business individual as well, is certainty, right? So providing certainty in planning and risk mitigation of what Mike wants to have from a capital allocation basis. And I think from a policy basis, right, we can certainly do that in a variety of different layers. So as I just referenced in my leadoff remarks, the federal government is still building and releasing, as they just announced here in the U.S., about $160 million of catalytic funding focused chiefly towards medium and heavy duty vehicles. Now, I think it's going to still remain to be seen of how that will actually pan out in terms of its utilization. But I'd say from a federal perspective, on a policy orientation, what they need to do is provide that certainty, right? Not undulations in the federal administration. I think those signals are most best sent from a funding and investment direct to manufacturers, but also from an area not just in DOE, but looking to other appropriation areas like the Department of Transportation. Also layering that with folks like housing and urban development as well, to understand that it's not just A, B, C, or D. It's really an E, all of the above approach with regard to federal-based investments and funding in order to move not just traditional infrastructure, right? So areas where we might charge, areas where we might fuel up on a hydrogen-fueled vehicle as well, but maybe some of the soft infrastructure as well, understanding the implications on a personal basis. I think to Lolita's kind of more market areas on a tight urban infrastructure. I'm going to layer this down now to a state. I think states need to do a few things. First off, they need to set bold and ambitious zero emissions vehicle goals, right? So some of the poster childs of that include not just California, but also literally the state of New York, right? From a state and from a city base as well. That consistent tone in weathering that diesel storm, I guess you could say, is important. Not being fair weather on an administrative basis. That yes, some of this will take some reorganization and there might be some pinch and pain points along the way. But as Lolita articulated, that 15-year consistency of setting a time period and a glide path for that to happen with carrots and also appropriately lagging with sticks as well, I think is really important. I'll add concurrent on a state basis, and I am going to tap the horn here, I think, of the state of Arizona, is viewing this as an economic development and retention job creation opportunity. So here in the state of Arizona, we are home to a wonderful organization called Nikola Motors, right, which is the hydrogen electric heavy and medium duty organization. They've invested a significant amount of money from a labor and a manufacturing basis here. They've partnered with our state economic development organizations in order to help empower and accelerate that. So our state-based leadership recognizes the very bullish opportunity. So I think engaging that conversation from a certainty base, but also recognizing that this is an area from manufacturing, development, creation that is very exciting from a job perspective, that bridges this conversation of just eco to economic development and financial opportunity on the state and a regional base. And then, so I'm going to leave it right there. Is that specific enough for you, David? Would you like me to expand a bit further, perhaps?
Well, we got lots of time, so we'll see. It was fantastic. Thank you very much. And it did give me some thoughts about some comments you could make, Mike, and I also wanted to follow up because you've more than put your toe in the water on some alternative fuels, and I'd be interested from your perspective. So later in the conversation, we can talk a bit more detail on policy. From your perspective as a major fleet owner in Canada, what's realistic today with current technology, if the infrastructure was there, to use for your business? Could you take the technology that was used in Whistler if there were fueling stations and operate it more broadly? Could you switch to electric for school buses, which are have a place to sleep at night? Bearing in mind, as people may not know in this call, Canada does have across a Trans-Canada highway a network of chargers for cars, not really for heavy duty vehicles, but we have you could drive an electric car across Canada today with proper charging stations. So I'd be interested to hear from a commercial operator, from a business perspective, if the infrastructure are there, what would work economically and technically for you today? And is there a different context depending on whether it's intercity or intracity? And do you have any thoughts on freight, including the company that Colin referred to?
David, very good questions indeed. Absolutely. If the infrastructure was in place, we could absolutely go to electric tomorrow. We do have some issues surrounding the duty cycle of the vehicle, where we have maybe, for example, as you brought up, an intercity service. That would be difficult. Often it just doesn't, the range with the batteries is still being developed, and our intercity services would be challenged, for example, running electric. With the battery capacity taking most of the underfloor luggage space, it really limits the ability of the vehicle to be ideal for its usage. When you've got a duty cycle of a school bus, a short run in the morning, a short run in the afternoon, an ability to charge in the middle of the day or overnight, that works really well. So, depending on the application of the unit, the vehicle, many different alternative fuels do work. I mean, natural gas works also, and in fact, we had a natural gas provider approach us willing to invest over $1 million of his money, their money, in a fueling infrastructure for us at our location, pending that we would purchase a sufficient amount of natural gas on a monthly basis. So, there is options out there on alternative fuels. It's when it gets to the electric side, which seems to be where, the world is going, that the private sector does need some type of partnership and working with the public sector and our cities, states, and provinces to figure out how we can work together to build the infrastructure for all users. I mean, it's not just us, but as the electric cars in neighborhoods grow, we're going to see more demands upon the infrastructure that is going to take some long range thinking and planning for municipal departments and the like. So it's doable. It's happening today, but I think that I just go back to the government and saying that we need to work closer together, the private sector and the public sector, to make the big leap that we're all wanting to save our climate. So it's a big challenge.
It's incredibly
David,
helpful, Mike. Yes, I was going to go to you, Lolita, but you can jump in. I have a follow-up, but I'll ask it after.
Can I add to what both of them said, because I think it's really important from a particular city point of view and perspective. I worked closely with people in the Department of Transportation. The first deputy commissioner is someone I've known for years, and my last conversation with her was about the challenges of charging infrastructure in New York City. Nobody wants to give up a parking spot. Nobody has driveways, right? So how are you going to do this? In a densely populated place like New York City, people are not going to adapt electric vehicle technology to a large degree till they know they can charge their car somewhere. So it's a chicken, egg, cart, horse situation, and it's going to be really challenging. And as you just said, public and private have to come together to get these solutions done and figure it out. Because if you don't get the charging infrastructure in the densely populated places at scale, people won't buy cars as much, and it's just sort of be a slippery slope. So it's really important on the private perspective, and as far as individual cars, but also with the fleets, because even with the fleets, you may even run out of spaces to be able to, as you say, charge. You can charge buses because of the load use, but what about sanitation trucks and things like that? It might take longer. So there's a lot of solutions that have to be employed for this, and hopefully that they'll be able to come together with the public sector and the private sector coming together to do those solutions. So I did want to comment there, because that's something that a lot of us talk about a lot when we're together in the city.
Excellent intervention. Can you talk a bit? You mentioned Keith, the head of fleet. I'd just be interested. I think people might be interested in that complex environment. And, all of us have watched Seinfeld. We know how people behave in New York around parking from watching television. In that complex environment, how has Keith managed to move so much of your fleet? I think you said 19,000 vehicles, a huge chunk of which is electric. I know you have an electric garbage packer, it's a test, for example, huge chunk of which are hybrids. How has he managed to do that? Is he a policy guru like Colin, or, a business leader like Mike? Like what has he been able to do that might be a lesson for people here to help that change happen?
Well, once the mandate came back down, because a lot of this started under the Bloomberg administration, because as I said earlier, I was in government a really long time. So the last two terms of Michael Bloomberg, I was there, including when Plan YC was written. And one of the things that was determined way back then in 2007 or 8 is that we needed to move to hybrid cars. So I remember when I had a car assigned to me in 2009, it was a hybrid. And so this process has been going, and Keith has been with the city government that long. So this process has been happening iteratively over time. And once the determination was made that we really need to go this way, Keith was executing. So procurement, working with all the city agencies. As I said, many agencies have fleets of cars, as you can imagine. Department of Transportation, what they used to call brownies, the traffic cops, those are cars too. So our border is actually not in Manhattan. It's not in New York City. It's 100 miles away upstate. And so they actually have DEP police to protect the water from bioterror attack. And so we have all of those people have cars. So work with all the city agencies to make sure that their procurement processes were appropriate and helping them to do sourcing. He just really rolled up his sleeves and dug in. And even to the point of we had a Formula One race called Formula E, which was done by electric vehicles a few years ago through the streets of Brooklyn. And he proudly was there at the beginning of that, really touting the fact that New York City is leading on this work. So he's just been a cheerleader for it, but also rolling up in his sleeves and making sure it actually got executed rather than just talked about.
David, can I
fantastic. Yep, totally.
I think what Lolita has mentioned there, she mentioned kind of the intersection of policy and business, and I couldn't agree more, right? So I think on a policy basis, there's room and opportunity, and we tend to go down this path of like, incentives. Are we giving money to incent things? I think we can and absolutely should consider that as an additional tool in the toolbox. But I think on an urban basis, I think that there are non-monetary specific incentives that we really should consider and set frameworks from a state and a local basis. Things like building and development codes, right? On a non-monetary basis, is a developer going to be incented in a non-monetary basis to say, goodness, if you want to increase your lot coverage, if you remove perhaps traditional parking spots or put in EV or hydrogen-based spots, depending upon your pad, be it commercial or be it residential, we're going to let you expand your lot coverage on a development basis. Well, a developer cares about access to capital, time to market, and sense of place. If they can get more coverage per square foot, that's money in their pocket. They're going to move in that direction. You can also think about things like permitting queues, creating certainty across multi-jurisdictional areas. So if an enterprise on an infrastructure has to go from one city to a sister city directly adjacent to it with an entirely different set of policies, again, as I said at the top of the order, that creates inefficiency, creating understanding amongst multiple jurisdictions through things often like intergovernmental agreements, where organizations can piggyback on one another in order to have blanket-based policy. That's going to speed up the adoption to this. And that's a non-monetary market-based incentive. This is, I think, going to provide better certainty, right, to people like Mike when they want to deploy their capital, combined with, I think, some of the obviously federal and state level investments in order to build that hard-based infrastructure and the certainty from point to point.
Can I add to his answer? The particular first point you said is very important because we did that with bicycle parking. So if you were building and you needed a zoning variance or something to some degree, we made you have bicycle parking provided. So maybe the next iteration of that is you must have electric charging vehicle or electric charger, if you have parking within your building lot, for example. So that might be something that could be considered in cities in the future.
One of the gifts of C40 cities that Mayor Gallego is part of is that we do share these best practices, and mayors feel free to steal from each other. Vancouver, Canada actually does have such a mandate today. So I'm sharing that with our American and Mexican colleagues. Feel free to steal Canada's best ideas, just not our best people. Mike, can I just ask you a quick follow-up, and then maybe we can have a couple of questions from participants if there are any. Do you think, and based on your professional experience, your comment about school buses potentially working for electric would apply to couriers and post offices who run fleets that don't necessarily have to run 24 hours on their urban part of their fleets, the intra-city as opposed to the inter? And secondly, could you speak a bit more about your experience with hydrogen in Whistler? I think it would be interesting to people. Is that something, electric technology clearly works in some applications now. Maybe battery size needs to be lighter for others. Is hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells ready today, or is that something that's still down the road?
Well, David, that's a good question because when we were R&Ding and piloting the hydrogen buses, that was back in 2010 for the Canadian Winter Olympics. And, in the end, after running the vehicles for 2 years, We had to get the fuel from Quebec, so we had over 2,200 miles across Canada that the fuel had to be delivered. So you look at that carbon footprint, did it really make sense at the time? No, it didn't. And, I believe hydrogen is coming and potentially is going to be a fuel that for the future. But, in our test and our demonstration that we did for 24 months for the province of British Columbia, it really was not economical. It it didn't make sense for the costs involved and the efforts involved to basically produce water. Because that's what hydrogen when you the only byproduct of the vehicle operating was water dripping out of it. So in the winter, we had to make sure that the bus stops that the water wouldn't drain out there to make them all icy so that people would slip to get on in the winter. But that was just one of the funny challenges that we had with it. But on the electrical side, we're seeing the duty cycles go longer. Many of the couriers throughout North America and the world are buying electric for that last mile. And I believe that the technology that we're there basically where an electric vehicle can operate on a low duty cycle for 8 hours. And so it's there. This last mile delivery, I've just recently heard many large courier companies buying electric to demonstrate that as we speak. So it's here, it's on our doorstep. And as we get it out and get it used and see what happens with the vehicles and how it all works, we're just going to get better at it. But so it's coming, definitely. Thank you.
Great, fantastic, very helpful. We have about 7 minutes left, so I thought, Heidi, if there are any questions from the participants, we could take one or two now. If we have people who would like to ask any of our terrific panelists a question about, about anything, but particularly about climate and fleets, feel free, or I'll follow up with some questions that I have arising out of this very interesting conversation.
Hello, David. Thank you. So we do have a couple questions from the audience to the panelists. So the first one, you've given us a great sense of what cities and even businesses can do to move us to zero emissions vehicles. And the reality is that much of the infrastructure, especially as it impacts international trade, rests with state and provincial national governments. So what can cities do to motivate their governments to move initiatives forward? If you could please expand on that.
Okay, who'd like to take that?
I'd be happy
Lolita?
to, maybe from a broad base.
Colin?
And then
Great.
I love Lolita's thoughts from kind of leveling up, given the push here. I think, again, it's deploying and setting certainty and, frankly, honestly, changing some of the conversation. So I think when state houses recognize the reality of cross-border trade and the impact that has on the region from a taxable revenue basis, and how organizations, right, UPS and other major freight carriers signaling they are investing in electric and hydrogen vehicles. Seeing the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs that places like Nikola here in the state of Arizona are bringing to the region in order to facilitate and encourage that cross-border trade. I think these cities can illustrate, because at the end of the day, cities and mayors have to get stuff done, right? It's kind of what mayors say, generally speaking. And they're responsible for jobs. They're responsible for local tax implications. The jobs and the economic rationale and argument here and the growth capacity and the curve of where this is going, I think makes one heck of an argument to anyone in a state house, right? They can think what they want about climate, and it is happening. It is a crisis. It is absolutely bona fide. But when we couple to that economic development growth opportunity from an innovation and job creation, I think any state house would frankly be foolish not to wildly entertain that and move that forward. But I'd welcome Lolita on this.
Anything?
Yeah, my main addition was about, just basically what he just said about jobs. To us, it's about jobs, really, making sure that in this transition that we are moving away from things that are polluting our city to things that are helping our city be cleaner and more efficient, that those solutions can be green and we can get new jobs coming in to do that. Also, even looking at the existing assets that we have, as I said, Hunts Point Food Market, half the food in New York City comes in through that one market, which, as you can imagine, we have 8.6 million people. That's hundreds of tons, thousands of jobs, and not even just making it resilient, but also making sure the trucks that are constantly going in and out of there are not polluting the neighborhoods around there. So you have to make sure that whatever you put in place accounts for the people who live there, as well as economically viable solutions. And so that's why for us, it's really an imperative to make sure that we continue to have that market work in a viable way, but also make sure we're attracting more businesses to New York City and New York State overall. Another thing that's happening is that we are going to have wind farms. We're going to have offshore wind farms in New York State in a number of years, and we want to make sure that we get some of those infrastructure jobs, which also will have lots of freight coming in and out with the parts. Wind farms and wind turbines are very, very large, so which means we're going to have some pretty big vehicles, some pretty big infrastructure that we're going to need to put in place for that. And so jobs is really the key to making sure that we are on top of that, I think.
Heidi, I think there's time for one quick more question, and then I'll get the panelists' final comments.
Yes, thank you. So in Arizona, we have APS and SRP. So what is the role of and or for these energy producers in advancing this agenda?
Well, I can take that quickly, but I welcome the feedback from the rest of my panelists on a utility basis, right? So utilities, right? APS and SRP in the state of Arizona, along with another organization named TEP, Tucson Electric Power, really are the capital three utilities here. They have an inextricable link to the success or not of EV-based infrastructure in the future of fleet. So while we can opine about the necessity to build infrastructure, utilize it on a management basis, and I'm sure we could have a whole nother panel about energy management and the complexities of that, but our utilities absolutely need to be a player proactively at the table. I also think, depending upon each state's regulatory orientation, be it a governor or be it independent operators, need to send clear signals of where they also want to use those utilities to go, of how they operate from an outcomes base or from an incentive base as well.
Fantastic, Colin, and thanks to the participants for their questions. I'm going to ask the panelists to wrap up. I'm going to start with Lolita Jackson, and you got 45 seconds to say anything you like, but if you could keep it to that sort of time, please.
I'll just leave with this. So the new company that I work for is not a new company. They've been around since 2007. They just signed with BP in the UK to put in 100 charging stations across the UK. So it is starting to happen where those deals are being made to help make sure that infrastructure is going in a broad-based way. And I'm happy to be part of the solution on the other side now.
Financing matters. Thanks very much, Lolita. Colin, 30 seconds to you, and then 30 seconds to Mike. Final thoughts.
Happy to do it on a personal basis. Lolita, let's get Mike, you, me, and David here for an Arizona, right? You get a Cardinals. Give me a Calgary Flames game versus our Coyotes here, and we can talk about renewable infrastructure. I think that's going to be a good takeaway from here. I think it's consistency, tone from the top, states and regions not only setting ambitious goals, but frankly disclosing to folks like CDP in a transparent and an open manner about that, and treating this, as I will go from the top of my order, like the health crisis and the equity and justice concerns that transportation, not just on fleet, but to city bases as well, that have the multitude of issues, but also the multitude of benefits of going zero emissions.
And Mike, final word to you from somebody who lives this every day about the transition of fleets in a world of climate action.
Well, you know, climate change and is a huge problem for the world. We all need to be working together on it. And we've really got to put down the barriers that exist between organizations, between cities, government, and really understand that this is something that we need to do together. That's my last word, Dave. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much to the panelists. I know that all of the participants here are applauding in their homes. I'm applauding in reality. You were terrific. Thanks so much, Heidi. Back to you.
Thank you all for another fantastic conversation and a sharing of knowledge and ideas as we continue day 2 of our Trilateral Conference. Right now, though, we'd like everybody to stop what they're doing because we really want to take a moment to remember and honor our friends who perished recently in a tragic plane crash near Hermosillo, Mexico. And a few of those folks are very close to the Phoenix Sister Cities Commission. This includes Leo Siscomani, who lost his life, and the wife of our colleague Enrique Ruiz, who is actually planning to join all of us here for this amazing conference. So if we can, just for a few seconds, let's take a moment to honor these colleagues in a moment of silence. Thank you very much for that.